Have you ever had sleep paralysis? Ever since I was a little girl, I've had nightmares. Almost every night since age 4. I'm 20 now. I either have a dream or I don't dream at all. I guess I've gotten used to it. One thing I can't get used to, though, is sleep paralysis. I've been experiencing it for a long time now, but no matter how much it happens, I can't adjust to it. Some of my worst episodes have been seeing a shadowy, humanoid figure jumping up and down violently next to my bed. Seeing thousands of tiny shadow hands, only hands, trying to pull the covers off of me, and a big fucking spider crawling on my paralyzed body, getting closer and closer to my face, and me not being able to do anything about it. Since I get nightmares so often, I've figured out a way to wake myself up from them, by shaking my head as hard as I can. Nothing else works, only shaking my head. It's pretty easy to recognize when a dream is starting to turn scary when it happens every time you have one. Eventually, I started being able to recognize when I'm going through sleep paralysis as well. Turns out the frantic head-shaking method works for that too. It's easier to recognize when I'm having sleep paralysis than when I'm having a nightmare because I'm actually awake during sleep paralysis, and whenever an episode starts, everything immediately feels wrong. Like that feeling you get when you're at the top of a roller coaster and you know it's too late to back down and the only thing waiting for you now is suffering. That feeling, but amplified. Usually when I have a nightmare, I try to wake myself up right away, but I find sleep paralysis really fascinating, so sometimes I stay in it even though I know how to make it stop. I'm always kind of curious to see what my own personal demon has planned for me. Wouldn't want all its work to go to waste. Anyway, time to get to the point. The other night I got sleep paralysis again. This time my demon was sitting on the floor watching me, almost like it was waiting for something. Since it was just sitting there, I decided to wait until it did something. I waited and waited for what felt like an eternity, but must only have been a couple of minutes. That's when it moved. It started sort of jerking around and twitching, reminding me of the monsters from the game, Afraid of Monsters. It creeped me out pretty good, so I decided to try and wake up, but I couldn't. I shook my head as much as I could, but it didn't work. The shadowy figure got up off the floor and started moving towards me. I tried to scream, but it was like I didn't even have any vocal cords. The only thing I could do was watch as the thing made it closer and closer to my bed. I was so scared it physically hurt. The figure was standing above me, shaking and jerking around, but then it suddenly stopped. It crouched so that where its mouth would be if it had a face was next to my ear.
"You can't escape,"
it whispered in a voice that sounded like a mix of 20 different ones, both male and female, grown-up and child. Then it started screaming, right into my ear, so loud I thought my head would explode. And then it stopped, and I could move again. Needless to say, I didn't sleep anymore that night. Actually, I haven't slept ever since. That was about a week ago. I've started hearing whispers and seeing twitchy, shadowy figures at the corner of my eyes. But of course when I turn to look, there's nothing there. Every time I see it, it seems closer than the last. I'm scared of what will happen when it reaches me. Maybe it's real. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I never woke up. Yeah, that's gotta be it. I'm still dreaming. And I can't seem to wake up. My neighbor Jeff's yard is so green. He has the best yard in the neighborhood. The grass is so green and lush that it would make even the most accomplished horticulturalist jealous. Recently, I was feeling insecure about my yard, with all its withered flowers and weeds, and I took it upon myself to ask him how he keeps his grass so green. I asked him if it was from the fertilizer, daily sprinkling of water droplets to keep the blades moist, or some other method that he used to keep his yard looking so fresh and vivacious. The entire time I rambled on about how good his yard looked and how beautiful his garden was, he glared at me suspiciously. Apparently, he was distrustful of those who longed for the knowledge that he evidently held so close to his chest. He peered down at me through glasses that dangled precariously off of his nose and folded his arms in front of his chest, not caring that his gardening gloves were covered in dirt and fertilizer. He gave me one last glare, holding it a few seconds longer, and then walked past me into his house. Since he didn't even give my question the time of day, I decided to do some snooping and see if I could figure out his secret for myself. The next few days I tried to keep my lingering glances to a minimum so he wouldn't suspect I was spying on him. Eventually, when it seemed like he had let his guard down slightly, I took action. I noticed that every night at 2 a.m., like clockwork, he would make his way out into his back garden and lock himself in his shed. He would stay in there for hours, only coming out when it was necessary to get back to his house before the sunrise. I found this action suspicious. Why did he feel the need to conduct his business under the veil of night? What was he doing in his shed? What was he hiding? About a month after I asked him about his lawn, he asked me to watch his house and let his dog out because he was going on holiday. I told him that I would absolutely do that for him, as he was kind enough to do the same for me the previous month. Secretly, though, I was planning how I was going to break into his shed and snoop around. He seemed to have forgotten all about the yard incident, for which I was thankful. The next week, after he left, I let myself into his house to take his dog on a walk. When I finished, I snuck into his backyard. Even though he wasn't home, I crept up to the decrepit shed and turned the handle. It was locked. Fair enough, I had expected that. I was going to have to come up with an alternative plan. A few years ago, I bought a lock-picking kit. I wanted to learn to pick locks to impress a girl. Don't judge me, it was stupid, I know. Anyway, I remembered that I still had the little kit tucked away somewhere in my kitchen. I ran back to my house to find the kit, then realized that if I grabbed it and ran back to his shed, it would look like I was stealing something. I internally berated myself, and slowed my pace down to a meander. When I got home, I immediately went about finding the kit and formulated a new plan. I would sneak back over to his shed under the guise of night and pick the lock to his shed. Once inside, I would figure out why he kept such a pitiful-looking shed so tightly locked up. Finally, after what felt like eternity, night fell. I changed into a different outfit, one that would suit my mission, grabbed my lock-picking kit and a flashlight, and hurried out the back door. I crept stealthily into my neighbor's backyard, careful to avoid making unnecessary noises, and crept slowly in the direction of his shed. I pulled my lock-picking kit out of my sweatshirt pocket and carefully and quietly began fidgeting with the lock. After a few moments, I felt the lock click and the door swung open. I looked behind me to ensure I wasn't followed, and stepped into the darkness, pulling the door closed behind me. I was immediately met with the putrid odor of aerated fertilizer and something vaguely metallic in nature. I felt myself cough and dry heave as the smell wafted its way up my nostrils and down my throat. My legs suddenly quivered beneath me, and I shot my arms out into the darkness, grasping for something to hold onto so I wouldn't collapse. My left hand landed in something wet, and I instantly pulled it back, prompting my legs to reboot and my body to crumble to the floor. I let myself lie there for a few seconds before begrudgingly lifting my head up from the floor. I fumbled for the flashlight in my pocket and pulled it out. I shakily stood up, dazed from my sudden dizziness, and flicked on the flashlight. The sight that met my eyes will haunt me until the day I die. I shone the flashlight around, revealing several suspicious dark stains on the cement. But when I moved the flashlight from the floor to the workbench, the true horrors were revealed. Sitting on the workbench, in a sticky pool of blood, like that was where it belonged, was a severed arm. Next to it were chopped up pieces of flesh, an enormous knife, and a large pile of fertilizer. I swallowed the scream, and the bile in my throat, and kept looking. Across the room from the workbench was a large freezer. I already had a hunch about what was inside, but I opened it anyway. The contents didn't surprise me, but I still fought the urge to vomit when I saw the dismembered corpse. After all, there are some things that you never want to see, and this was one of them. After scanning the limbs in the freezer, I quickly realized that there were too many limbs for just one body. I slammed the freezer lid and turned to see a massive container of fertilizer with what looked to be chunks of human flesh in it. I remembered something I read online recently about how decomposing corpses made grass greener, and suddenly the realization hit me. This time, when I felt the bile rise in my throat, I did nothing to stop it, only aiming for the garbage can in the corner of the room. This happened maybe about 5 years ago, and I haven't really shared it with anyone because honestly I never thought it was that big of a deal until I really looked back on it. When I was towards the end of high school, my brother was just getting started, and since we've always been very close, we hung out often with a few close friends. We were also both in a pretty bad place mentally, depressed, angry, and getting into trouble, being reckless, teenager stuff. One night, we were driving around with a good friend pretty late, after midnight if I recall, looking for problems to get involved with when my brother started to scream, like a crescendo, as if you were slowly realizing something was horribly wrong. I remember screaming too because he had startled me, but by the time I had the composure to ask him what had happened, he had gone rigid and fallen backwards onto the car's center console. Luckily, this only lasted a second, and he started yelling, "I saw the devil. I saw the devil." Obviously, I asked him things like where, when, and what happened, but he just kept saying, he was right there, without pointing or anything, just staring at the ceiling of the car. When I was finally able to get it out of him, he told me that he was looking out the window at a red light, and the man in the car next to him, totally nondescript, brown hair, regular build, turned to him, and his face opened like a black abyss, just like in horror movies, and he spoke directly into my brother's thoughts, saying something along the lines of,
"I have seen you now."
Strangely enough, neither of us were very fazed after the initial scare. We've lived in haunted houses our whole lives, and I've always been interested in the occult, so we were ghoulishly flattered that the devil would show up to curse my brother personally, and we joked about it all the time. What I do find strange is looking back as an adult, my brother was different for years afterwards. He would make strange noises and scream or yell all the time when he was alone in his childhood bedroom, and he would sometimes laugh and casually mention to me that there was a worm living in his head with him. He told me that the worm hated him and wanted him dead, and that's why he would yell all the time. He was yelling at the worm to leave him alone, yelling to prove to the worm that he wouldn't die no matter what it told him to do. He would also feel bugs on his skin all night, and he would see shadows and figures that spoke to him even in broad daylight. This would continue until the day he moved away to college and out of his old bedroom, where I believe the worm took up residence after we went home that first night. When he moved out, the voices stopped, and the shadows faded. We're still close, and he's doing very well for himself right now with a job and an apartment of his own, but I can't help thinking that maybe we should have taken it all more seriously. Like I said, we were edgy teens and thought it was fun to have been visited by the devil, but now that I'm older, I wonder if it really damaged him in some way, because he was never the same goofy, carefree kid after that. We were children, really. What did we know about anything? Sure, passionate, confident, and going to live forever. Be young forever. We didn't understand. How could we? Picture a group of kids somewhere between learning to drive and riding the high, beautiful cusp of early, not quite adulthood. Riding in a car which belongs to someone else's parents. No one inside, laughing, has any idea, no real idea, of insurance, loan payments, the tedium of never quite having enough to cover what's needed. On the radio is Elvis, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Iron Maiden, Nirvana, Slipknot, Five Finger Death Punch, Candlemass, or Gorilla Riot. It doesn't matter. Kids cruising with the radio blasting is cross-generational, common ground. The only change is the music. We liked rock. Beating down the back roads, we hurried to nowhere, high on the camaraderie of imagined or inflated slights, artificial oppression, or assumed captivity. Finding solidarity in our complaints, our suffering, we used pain as the mortar to cement our love for each other. Nothing belongs like belonging. I remember testing the wind resistance with my hand, skating my fingers on the currents like a coaster riding invisible tracks. Late summer afternoon heat baked down on the asphalt, radiating back again. If not for our speed, the humid air would have been stagnant and hard to breathe. As it was, it cooled the big Bonneville, tickling the sweat on our brows and tousling our hair. I didn't mind. It felt good being in this place with these people. We stopped at a gas station. We were hungry, thirsty. Good-natured arguments followed about who owed how much and who bought what when. The arguing was bluster. Everyone departed the store with what they wanted. If someone was short, someone else stepped up. That's what friends do. Waiting by the car for the rest of the guys to finish paying, I sipped my Dr. Pepper, snacked on a Snickers. It could have been any group of friends anywhere in the country, but they were mine. Michael, athletic, good-looking, and a solid guy to have your back in a fight or as a wingman out and about. Darrell, like Mike, handsome, athletic, with the quickest wit of us all. And that was saying something. Darrell wasn't a great wingman, as the ladies tended to fight for his attention, but you could always count on him for a laugh. Riley had been part of our group since kindergarten. She always knew the best places to chill without crowds and was also handy in a fight. Trey was like me. Thin, bookish, introverted, into video games. How we managed to fit in with the other three is a mystery. We all just clicked together, content in our discontent, I suppose. When I think back, that's how I like to see them. Happy, together, whole, summer sun surrounding them in a golden aura. Crossing the parking lot together, the four of them drinking Dr. Peppers and laughing, embraced by the fragile immortality of our youth. Riley suggested we head for a little-known swimming hole, a place called the Deer Hole. Most people didn't go there because there were many other, more accessible places to swim, which didn't require a hike through the mountains. We readily agreed. Riley knew the spots. Back in the car, we continued along backcountry roads. Crowded on either side by lush green, we climbed sun-dappled hills and dipped slowly into shadowy valleys where the air temperature dropped pleasantly. We parked the car at a scenic overlook, part of the Appalachian Trail, stretching 2,190 miles from Maine to Georgia. While there were a few people picnicking at an attached park and more posing in front of the vistas, we started walking on the trail. Riley saw something she'd been looking for. It was all trees and rocks to me, and took us onto a smaller game trail. As we put more distance between us and the crowds of granola heads on the trail, the woods became somber. Our conversation died, each person unwilling to desecrate the holy silence with vulgar words. Like passing through a cemetery or crossing ancient battlegrounds, the woods felt sacred, and we lowered our eyes to watch our feet, kept our mouths closed. We'd walked for close to an hour, keeping our thoughts to ourselves, when Riley spoke. There we go. 3 words broke the melancholy spell around us. I became aware of birds chirping and unseen animals rustling in the undergrowth. I heard water. Insects resumed their buzzing as we formed a small semicircle around Riley. She pointed to a winding path leading down to a deep blue pond, roughly circular, its surface partly in the sun, partly beneath the shade of the surrounding trees. A switchbacked trail, flanked by a waterfall, twisted back and forth along the hillside. Beneath the waterfall, a thick rope, once white, now weather-stained, knotted with handholds every foot, led to a small rock ledge 12 feet above the surface of the pond. Perfect for diving. The shadows began to grow long. Dark comes early in the mountains. I'd almost completely dried off. I liked to swim, but the thought of all the dark water beneath me creeped me out. I couldn't shake the feeling a rotten hand, flesh picked away in spots, or a tentacle perhaps, grabbed my ankle, dragging me to impossible depths, to devour me underneath cold mountains. I left the water early, while Mike and Darrell were challenging each other to increasingly difficult dives. After a time, the rest of the group made their way to the shoreline beside me. We laid on the bank. Mike and I to Riley's left, Darrell and Trey to her right. Off to my right, I heard the unmistakable gurgle of Trey's vape, or his douche flute, as we affectionately called it, followed by the sickly sweet smell of cotton candy. To this day, I cannot stand the scent. It makes me nauseous. The conversation turned to the inevitable search for something to do. As it was getting on in the afternoon, I wanted to go eat. Swimming always makes me hungry. In the end, dinner won out. Swimming makes everyone hungry. The diner was attached to the gas station we'd stopped at for snacks, and it wasn't far. A unanimous decision was achieved in record time to head back for burgers and discuss further plans, after we'd eaten. Full of cheeseburgers, fries, and sweet tea, I leaned back in the booth, putting some distance between my plate and myself. Now no longer hungry, the smell of ketchup was making me feel ill. I've always been that way. Ketchup smells good at the start of a meal, disgusting by the end. Riley smiled at me, as did Trey, both understanding. They knew me. Mike and Darrell continued eating, oblivious. Those two put away some food, and were competitive about everything. So what's the plan? Mike asked around a mouthful of bacon cheeseburger. You guys want to go somewhere scary? Trey asked. Instantly intrigued, we readily agreed. Trey shared a few details. The place is called Black Hollow. I think it's near where we went swimming, but I'll Google it to be sure. What's Black Hollow? Never heard of it, Riley asked, eyes wide. My uncle told me about it. He said the entire area is haunted, but there's a house way back in the hollow where it's really bad, Trey said. Mike and Darrell paused their attempt to outgorge one another. Bad how? Asked Darrell. Uncle said there are places in this world which are pure evil, and don't, Trey made quote marks in the air with his fingers, abide human trespasses. Well, hell, said Mike. Now we have to go. Probably bullshit, said Darrell, picking at his fries, but I'm free. Let's do it. We'd been to other haunted places. We'd gone to the haunted tracks, where according to the story a school bus full of children were killed by a train. Whenever a car parked on the tracks, the ghosts of children pushed the car clear. We dusted the bumper and the track with flour before stopping the car. Sure enough, the car rolled off the tracks, and there were tiny handprints left behind. Another time, we went to an underpass rumored to be haunted, but the only thing happening there was boredom and cold. We'd been to haunted mansions and asylums. Once Darrell received a nasty scratch on his back from an invisible assailant. The scratch was raw and puffy and took nearly a week to heal. We thought we'd seen some things. We were wrong. On the drive over, Trey gave us the few details he had. His uncle told him Black Hollow was built on an old Indian burial ground, thus cursed. A quick Google search disproved this theory. Trey said the facts he discovered, and there were few, pointed to tragedy. Disease, namely smallpox, wiped out most of the families living in the area around the turn of the 20th century. The remaining people were plagued with madness and unsolved murders. Details were sketchy, but Trey said the theory of cursed ground made as much sense to him as any. The hollow got its name not from the infamous deeds committed there, but from a large family who settled in the area during the mid-1800s. Trey didn't find much on the Black family, where they were from, what happened to the survivors, or what they did for a living. The Blacks were as much a mystery as the haunted ground they'd left as a legacy. Looking at the map on Trey's phone, it would have been faster to cut back to the deer hole, skirt the mountain, and end up near the back of Black Hollow. No one wanted to navigate the woods in the dark, and if those woods were haunted, it seemed better to have a quick means of escape ready. We followed spiderweb back roads. I won't give directions. Look it up yourself if you're curious. Around the mountain to our exit. A simple street sign, green and white like any other, read Black Hollow. Mike turned the car onto Black Hollow Road. The pavement ran to gravel in less than half a mile. Mike slowed the car to a mellow 25 miles an hour. Tires crunched along contentedly. Lightning bugs were out. The fields surrounding us were filled with flashing greenish-yellow messages. The mountains on either side quickly moved in to squeeze our little road between them. Along with the lightning bugs, cicadas were out, buzzing a droning song they'd waited 17 years underground to play. The evening would have been pleasant under other circumstances. We had the battlefield feeling again, like we were trespassers, interlopers, unwanted and uninvited guests to an exclusive gathering. My thighs were tight, my guts fluttering. I wanted to leave, tell Mike to turn around and get us the hell out of there. I couldn't embarrass myself in front of my friends. I wish I had. The gravel road dead-ended in front of an old dilapidated two-story farmhouse. A front porch, once might have been inviting, yawned mutely at us, boards missing like rotten teeth. The front door hung on a single hinge, a failing sentimental between us and the darkness within. Mike circled around to point the car out, away from the house. Just in case, he said, leaving the keys hanging in the ignition. We stepped out into a yard overgrown with weeds. All was silent except for the cicadas. They were, if anything, louder with the engine noise and rocky crunch of grinding gravel. A small dust cloud, thrown by tires, followed us, clinging to the car, the windshield making me sneeze. The oppressive feeling of being watched, being hated, broke my skin out in goose flesh. Darrell pulled flashlights from the trunk, one for each of us, and I heard him exclaim, "Oh shit, Mike, where did you get this?" "Dad gave it to me last Friday. Careful, I've got it loaded with pumpkin balls," which he pronounced punkin. Riley, Trey, and I walked around to the trunk to see what had Darrell so excited. Mike lifted a pump shotgun by the stock. Keeping the barrel pointed skyward, Mike dropped the weapon onto his shoulder, cool and casual. The weapon was black in the moonlight, sleek and deadly, leaning against Mike's shoulder like it had always been there. "Why would we need that?" Riley asked, mirroring my own thoughts. The house was abandoned, despite my case of the willies. There wasn't even any trash in the yard, indicating a distinct lack of squatters. "Might be snakes," Mike answered. He'd never taken a weapon with us before, and I didn't think we needed one now. Our safety lay in our numbers. We didn't split up. We stuck together, going everywhere as a group. Riley rolled her eyes. She headed for the drunken floor, leading the way as usual. Trey followed her, then me, with Darrell and Mike bringing up the rear. Riley lifted the door handle, and Trey put his shoulder to the wood and pushed. Together, they managed to get the door to scrape open. I noticed a large wasp nest, its occupants yellow and red striped, flitting their wings menacingly, but didn't take flight. Making my way across the uneven boards, I was grateful wasps are reluctant to fly in the dark. We gathered inside the threshold. A rectangle of moonlight illuminated a dusty wooden floor, hiding the rest of the space in darker shadow, if not for our flashlights. 5 beams bobbed to and fro, cutting the black. A staircase to our left led to a hallway which overlooked the entranceway, what I assumed was a parlor room to our right, large picture windows overlooking the porch. And the wasp nest, I thought. Above our heads, an old cast-iron chandelier hung. A few of the holders still contained candles. I'd never seen a chandelier without electricity. The entranceway continued into the house, becoming a living room. The place seemed much larger on the inside. From the yard, I would have guessed 30 feet, maybe 40, and you'd be in the backyard. We'd covered that distance, and were standing just underneath the overlook. It didn't seem possible. I turned around, shining my light towards the open door. It appeared smaller, like we'd traveled further than our 24 steps. If not for our flashlights, we wouldn't have been able to see anything. The interior was dark. A pair of French doors separated the living area from a kitchen. Darrell scraped the doors open, which groaned a rusty protest. Our footsteps echoed as there was no carpeting, almost no furniture at all. The walls were covered in silk wallpaper, which might have been striped yellow and white. It was faded and torn, peeling off the walls, so I couldn't be sure. Every so often, an empty cast-iron sconce mounted into the plaster, most without a candle. Along the falling wallpaper, framed photos stared at us. Hundreds of old black-and-white photos of somber children, scowling men, and severe women marked our passing with disapproval. I wondered why there were so many photos and almost no furniture. Who lives like that? The condemning stares were almost too much to bear. Mike swung the shotgun back and forth, muzzle down, like he was trying to decide on a target. Beyond the French doors, our view of Photography Hall was mercifully blocked. The weight of the stairs lingered. "Well," Riley said, "that was creepy as fuck." The rest of us barked out much-needed tension-relieving laughter. "Where's all the furniture?" Trey asked. "Who decorates a house with creepy-ass pictures?" Darrell responded. A staircase in the kitchen led to the second floor. Another door hid a staircase to a basement. I didn't see a way out other than the way we'd come in. "Up or down?" I asked. Neither looked inviting. "Up," said Riley. We went up the stairs, which smelled like mildew and neglect. Paint had fallen off the wood, which had swollen and shrunk with moisture. The floor felt unsteady beneath our feet. At the apex, we found ourselves at the end of a long hallway, presumably the one which overlooked the entrance. A sharp, musky tang, like burned caramel, filled the air. "Is it me, or is the house growing?" Riley asked. "Yeah, it seems bigger inside. Stinks, too," Mike answered. "How can a house grow?" Trey asked. Not being confrontational, he was scared. All were. Trey was looking for a logical explanation for the illogical things we were experiencing. "Listen," Darrell hissed. I heard it, a low drone not dissimilar to the cicadas. "Behind that first door." Mike nodded in the direction. Standing in a semicircle outside the door, our ears to the wood, listening to an insectile buzz growing in pitch, louder, and pulsing as if aware of us. "Oh, fuck it," Trey said, flinging the door open and rushing across the threshold. Trey began screaming immediately, before his scream cut off in a choking retch. Trey had stomped into a room nearly consumed by a yellow jacket nest. Throwing open the door ripped into their papery domain, the wasps exploded into action, instantly covering Trey in their stinging, pulsing bodies. Somehow, he managed to turn and slap the door closed, cutting us off from the fury of the swarm, trapping himself inside. Hundreds of angry wasps made it into the hallway before Trey slammed the door, the air filled with angry insects. Darrell knocked me against the wall as he ran past, slapping at his head. Mike, Riley, and I followed, panicked, desperate to escape. We thundered down the stairs, pursued by the stinging mob. They were in my hair, stinging my scalp, on my clothes. Following my friends, unaware Trey was still upstairs, I banged my hip on a counter. In my frenzy, I hardly noticed. Darrell missed the French doors, running instead into the basement. Mike, Riley, and I followed. "Shut the door! Shut the door!" Mike screamed. I jerked it closed behind me, distantly aware of the sound of yellow jackets hitting the other side. Ping, ping, ping. Downstairs in the dark, we slapped and crushed anything crawling on us. For several minutes, the only sounds were Riley's crying, our moaning, and the slapping of hands followed by the stomping of feet. Eventually, the angry buzz died off, leaving us alone with our pain. I'd managed to hang on to my flashlight. Riley still held hers. "Trey?" I asked. Upstairs," Riley said, choking off a sob. She sounded strange. Her lips and eyes swelled to cartoonish proportions. My left eye had already swollen almost completely shut. "We need to go get him," Mike said. "How?" Darrell answered. "We have to try," Riley said. "If Trey hadn't shut the door, we'd be dead too." "Trey saved us," I said. "They were all over him, every inch. No way he survived. The relative few escapees nearly killed the four of us. We have to go get help." Silence and nods greeted my statement. None of us liked admitting it, but Trey was likely dead. We needed help to recover his body. Looking around the basement for another exit besides the one to the kitchen. Ground floor windows covered with grime stared at nothing, refusing to budge. Otherwise, the basement stood as empty as much of the house, the exception being a baby's wooden cradle against the back wall. Darrell approached the cradle. Riley gave him her light, which he used to peer cautiously inside. "All we need is another damn swarm," Darrell said. "No, it's empty. We're good." Darrell turned away. The cradle began to rock. The awful, metallic cicada drone increased in intensity. Riley pointed at the rocking cradle and shouted a warning. "Darrell, look out!" That was lost to the insectile buzz. I felt it vibrating in my chest. Forming a thought was difficult. From my angle, I couldn't see what came out of the cradle. I saw Darrell drop to his knees as something chewed on his neck. Mike squeezed the trigger on the shotgun, racked a fresh shell, and fired again. The roar of the blast was swallowed in the cacophony. Flames leapt from the barrel, and again, as Mike fired upon the thing on Darrell's back. He missed his mark, and the cradle disintegrated. Blood splattered onto the wall. Darrell dropped face first onto the ground, his neck chewed through. Whatever was chewing on him shrieked, vanishing at the cradle's destruction. Mike grabbed me and shouted, "Come on, we have to go." Riley was running back up the stairs, back into the kitchen. I stumbled after Mike, who half-dragged me into the kitchen. The terrible noise intensified, vibrating my teeth, causing my nose to bleed. Riley ran toward the entrance. Mike followed, and I staggered along behind. The photos on the wall were blank. Their occupants stood to either side of the hall watching us run. We ran that impossible gauntlet, trying not to look left or right. All the while the noise got louder. I was having trouble moving. My bones shook. Riley reached the porch where she turned and pointed. Mike dragged me along by the collar. Throwing me outside, he turned to fire at whatever Riley was pointing at. I stood up. Mike braced himself in the doorway, firing round after round into the black. A shadow on the overlook moved toward the stairs. The pumpkin balls shattered the railing, tore large, dusty hunks from the wall behind and through the figure. It continued down the stairs, floating, moving as if on rails, ever closer. Mike's shotgun clicked empty as it reached toward him. Mike kept himself between it and Riley and me. It grabbed him around the throat, pulling him back inside. I saw through its hand. Mike's flesh smoked and blistered beneath its shadowy touch.
Run,
Mike croaked as his head burst into flame. We ran. I barely managed to get in the passenger door before Riley slammed the car into drive. The insectile drone vibrated the mirrors, but I still saw Mike's flaming body being dragged upstairs. A large black hand filled the doorway, reaching for us. Go, Riley, drive. She didn't need any encouragement. Stomping the gas, accelerating away from the house. The hand continued reaching for us. As it cleared the porch, it burst into flame, reaching, beckoning as we sped away. Once back on the main road, Riley pulled over and we sat there and held each other and cried. No one would believe what we saw, what we did. There are places on this earth inhabited by evil not of this world which brooks no trespassing. Evil exists. I swear every word is true. Hey Bear Buddies, thanks so much for joining me for this second edition of Furberries Fables. I sure hope you liked it. If you did, please like the video and consider subscribing. Furberries Fables 3 will be out in a week. Thanks again for watching.